Hello, and we are in week 4, which means we've been doing this for a whole month, which is very, very weird to me. Feels both like we have not been doing it that long and also like it's been a lot longer. I'm sure you can relate. And so, I mean, as of right now, I don't have a ton to update you on in terms of like orders of business, course stuff. If you haven't taken the conference period feedback survey, I would really appreciate it if you could do that. That is really useful information for me, and thank you to those who have done it already. You do have a quiz coming up on Sunday. Well, the quiz is already up, but it is due on Sunday, so if you could get that done, very much appreciate it. You also have your biodiversity project discussion board. So in case it wasn't crystal clear, essentially what I'm asking you to do is go outside if it's safe for you to do so, bring a camera, and go trounce around for a little bit, find a couple of organisms that are of interest to you. So this could be a plant, an animal, an insect, whatever, and go ahead and post that up on the discussion board for this assignment. Please include things like what time of day, what the local climate is like, where in the world was this taken. We have people in our group from all over the world right now, and so including like what is the local area that this was taken in will be very relevant, because then I want you to try to identify this organism. So tell me the genus and species. So it's not enough to say like, oh, I think this is a dandelion, right? You would want to say what is the genus that this plant belongs to, and then try to get as specific as the species, providing resources for how you came to that conclusion also. I am working on grading your videos. Sorry, it is taking me a little bit to get around to that. I have made it about halfway through, I think, of the chestnut blight article videos. Thank you for getting those in, and I'm still working my way through many of the video project where I had you look at the relationship between deforestation and an increase in human disease. So I will get those in as soon as I can. Sorry for the delay in that. This is going to be a little bit of a shorter one. We're just going to talk quickly about some of these processes involved in the cycling of nutrients throughout an ecosystem. So we have looked previously at how energy moves through an ecosystem, and that template is really a good basis for how to sort of frame everything else that we'll look at. So right now, let's talk about the carbon cycle. So as we know, carbon is the major ingredient for life. Every living system on Earth is carbon-based. So we are carbon-based, your houseplants are carbon-based, your cat and dog are all carbon-based. And so I think this really begs the question, well, I mean, now we've answered the question, but you know, this begged the question to earlier scientists who were sort of discovering this stuff. How did all of this carbon come together? And one of the ways that we've explained this, I mean, certainly we're not getting into the origins of life here, that's for another time, but thinking about how does carbon get sort of integrated into living systems. And then more importantly, since we know that carbon exists in abiotic factors, so things like rocks and the air and dissolved into the ocean in different compounds, how do we look at this process by which it goes from abiotic to biotic factors? And so, as I said, there is a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. So to define the atmosphere, we would say that this is referring to the gas layer surrounding the habitable surface of the Earth. And so we'd also find carbon, you know, in like fossil fuels, so the decomposed remains of ancient organisms that have undergone a specific chemical process to form what we now know as oil, but could also be referring to things like methane. Those would also be fossil fuels. You can find reservoirs of methane underneath the Earth. You'd also find carbon in sedimentary rocks, so things like limestone, which has the chemical formula CaCO3. And so this would be calcium carbonate, which also makes up the shells and coral reefs that we talked about finding in the ocean. And of course, you'd find carbon dissolved into the ocean in various different compounds, one of which would be calcium carbonate. And so the way we explain the movement of carbon throughout an ecosystem is really looking at this reciprocal and really somewhat equal movement of carbon between biotic and abiotic factors through the chemical reactions of cellular respiration, which you would have learned in fall term of Bio 500, and photosynthesis. And so if we remember looking at those chemical reactions, they are reciprocal. So the forward reaction for cellular respiration is the forward reaction for photosynthesis is the reverse reaction for cellular respiration. And so what I mean by that is that the reactants that go into cellular respiration are the products of photosynthesis. And so in my head, when I was like preparing to explain this, this was a little bit easier to say. But the forward reaction for cellular respiration is the reverse reaction for photosynthesis. And so anyway, this tells us essentially how we get carbon from the atmosphere, from an abiotic factor, and how we get it into a biotic factor. And so, you know, what's happening here is the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is taken up through the stoma of the plant, and that, you know, carbon dioxide is going to diffuse through the plant cell, through the stroma, and eventually make its way to the thylakoids in the chloroplast, where it will where it will help facilitate the chemical reaction of photosynthesis, which gives us the end product of glucose. And so this is useful for the plant because then the plant can metabolize the glucose and create ATP for itself. This is also useful for heterotrophs or consumers who cannot photosynthesize. So we are able to essentially take atmospheric carbon dioxide, run it through a plant, produce glucose, and then a heterotroph is able to consume that plant and have that bioavailable glucose to produce ATP from, because it cannot generate glucose for itself. And so we call this process essentially of consumption, we call this assimilation of carbon. And so the consumer eats the plant, now it has the carbon product, the glucose in it that the plant has produced. And so as this process is going on, the heterotrophs are consuming, they are ingesting glucose, and then they're breaking down glucose through the process of cellular respiration. Recall that one of the byproducts of cellular respiration is going to be carbon dioxide, which is released as a gas, literally through exhaling. And so in this way, carbon dioxide, some of the carbon dioxide is restored to the atmospheric reservoir through the respiration of consumers. And so this is largely a, you know, as I said, a reciprocal system. This is largely pretty balanced. And so, you know, before I get too far ahead, you know, you may also be noticing that the respiration of carbon dioxide doesn't fully account for perhaps all of the carbon that went into the system. And so we can't forget the decomposers also. The decomposers, remember, are fungi and bacteria whose job it is to break down biotic factors into their constituent molecules. And so if we have waste from the system, either in the form of a dead and decomposing organism, such as a plant or an animal, or also perhaps in the form of digestive waste, this is going to get broken down into the essentially carbon ingredients that it's made of, and returned to the atmospheric reservoir through the respiration and decomposition processes of those bacteria and fungi. And so circling back, as I said, these processes, this reciprocity of cellular respiration and photosynthesis are largely balanced. But then, cue in humans who are super good at things like using cars and running smartphones, and that's all cool stuff that we like to do. We are currently like watching Netflix all day, and that requires energy input. And the way we get energy right now, primarily in the US, is we use a lot of fossil fuels. Remember that fossil fuels are a carbon reservoir. And so when we burn fossil fuels, when we put those carbon molecules through a combustion reaction, something that is burning, right? We're inputting energy to break apart those molecules. That carbon is dissociated from its original molecule to something gaseous, and so it's able to return to the atmosphere. And so this causes an imbalance of CO2. This essentially means we're putting more CO2 into the atmosphere than the plants can possibly ever assimilate and convert into glucose. So one solution might be like put more plants up there. This is why they say like planting trees is good for the environment, because trees are producers, they are photosynthesizers, so they're able to absorb the carbon dioxide that we're inputting into the atmosphere. The issue is that we also need land for all the people that we've got. So we keep building houses and we keep developing land, and the more we develop the land, the less space there is for producers. So there's a lot of possible ways to approach this problem, but acknowledging it is a problem is the first step. And some unfortunately don't feel like this is a problem. And the accumulation of all of this carbon dioxide, unfortunately, has a lot of impacts. Humans can't we can't intake CO2 and do anything with that. It's a toxic compound to us. So too much CO2 in the atmosphere is problematic in that way. But also it reacts in the atmosphere with other molecules like nitrogen and oxygen, and forms molecules that essentially create a more effective and thicker insulative layer to the earth. So when I say insulative, I mean something that like insulates, so keeps warmer. And this is why we call them like greenhouse gases, because a greenhouse has a thick layer of something, usually plastic, that essentially keeps all the heat in there. And so what we're doing by continuously creating this imbalance of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is we're creating this like thick layer of gaseous compounds that are trapping the heat within the earth. And this is one of the things that is contributing to the changing climate and the warming of the planet. So that was a lot of information. Let's quickly talk about the water cycle. So this is, as you can imagine, the way water moves throughout an ecosystem, and it's pretty straightforward, I think. So it's a cycle, so we can start sort of at any point. I like to start at precipitation. So precipitation is the word we use, and this is very like 7th grade science, so you may have seen this stuff before. Precipitation tells us that through the condensation of clouds above the earth, clouds are just made up of water vapor. There is a limit to where they eventually condense, and then the water becomes essentially too condensed and must release. And so precipitation is the release of water from atmospheric clouds. And what form this takes depends on the local temperature. So if the temperatures are below let's say at or below freezing, so about 32 degrees Fahrenheit, then, you know, this might take the form of snow or potentially hail. If the temperatures are higher, so they're a little bit warmer, so we'll say they're above 32 degrees Fahrenheit, then we would get precipitation in the form of rain generally. So the clouds precipitate, they release a bunch of water, and so that water is eventually going to hit a surface, which makes sense. We call, you know, essentially the gathering and running of that water surface runoff. So it's hitting a surface and it is eventually running off. Let's say it hits a mountain, that water pools and eventually runs down the mountain. Well, eventually that runoff is going to end. It's going to hit a level surface, probably the ground, probably a level patch of ground. And from that point, it's going to undergo two potential processes depending on what type of surface it has landed on. So if that water has begun to pool on something like soil, then we would undergo the process of percolation, which is just water making its way into the soil where it can be absorbed by grasses and shrubs and trees and any other plant life that has its roots embedded into that soil so that it can uptake the water through the process that we've looked at last week. And so if that water happens to land on something more like rock, then we would have a process called seepage, which is when the water is going to pass through the rock and stone and will eventually form underwater reservoirs. So this is why, you know, some of you might have, if you have a well on your property, that well is normally connected to an underground reservoir of water, and that reservoir got there through the seepage of runoff from precipitation originally. So we've got our groundwater eventually. We've got runoff that is feeding plants and it is forming underground reservoirs. Perhaps it is also landing in lakes and oceans. The sun exists and it exists for the purpose, well, it doesn't exist for this purpose, but what it does for our planet is it warms the surface of our planet. And as water warms, it, you know, the molecules start to increase in motion, and eventually it gets warm enough that the molecules will evaporate and rise from the collection that they were in. So the sun is warming the surface and it is evaporating oceans, lakes, and streams. In that process of evaporation, again, the water molecules are essentially becoming separated from each other and they are rising into the air. Eventually, you get a lot of water molecules together and they condense, forming clouds, which repeats the cycle of precipitation when they condense sufficiently. The other way that we get water entering the atmosphere is through transpiration from plants. So this is why in areas of really dense plant cover, like say a tropical rainforest, you wind up with a lot of rain, because there is a lot of plants, they're intaking a lot of water, and then they are transpiring that water through their leaves where it enters the atmosphere, eventually is going to condense and rain back down. And this is a cyclical thing. So you wind up with a lot of rainfall in these areas. It's pretty neat. We also have cycles of nutrients, and let's see if I can move my video. Here we go. I've moved myself so you can see the screen a little bit better. We also have cycles of nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, and we did look at the nitrogen cycle. We won't look at the phosphorus cycle in detail, but what's important to know about the phosphorus cycle is that phosphorus enters the system through this weathering of rock. So precipitation occurs and it hits the rock and it releases inorganic compounds like phosphates. So this PO4 3- is how you'd read that. And the phosphates are taken up by plants in this process of assimilation again, which get consumed by heterotrophs and enter the cycle that way. We've talked about the process of the nitrogen cycle a couple of videos back, so I'd say go ahead and watch that if you need a refresher. But what's interesting is that phosphorus and nitrogen are both what we'd call like a limiting factor or a limiting reagent. You might remember that terminology from chemistry. We would say that these are limiting reagents for plant growth, meaning that they are essential nutrients for plants to grow and develop. And so if we don't have them, there's not going to be a ton of plant growth. So the interesting thing is, so think about lakes and ponds and swimming spots that you've been to, like natural swimming spots, not like a pool, right? If you've been to one that's got, it's crystal clear, it's nice and pretty, and you can like see the bottom, that's actually not an ecologically healthy water source. That is a water source that is like really replete of nutrients. It doesn't have enough phosphorus and nitrogen to sustain the life of algae and cyanobacteria that would populate that water source. And so without those producers being part of the water source, there are ecological chain reactions that result in other organisms being unable to survive as well. And so generally, like these really crystal clear lakes and stuff, you're not going to find a lot of things like fish or snails or other interesting things that you might find in a lake or pond. Makes for good swimming for people because we don't like to be, we don't like to have stuff on us. We like to be really clean. So it's fun for us. But ecologically, these are actually pretty unhealthy spaces. So ideally, what you want is some kind of balance. You want there to be, some phosphorus and nitrogen, and so you want there to be some plant life so that the ecology of the water space is, pretty good. But you can also have too much, and so so we have this like rainwater that's causing runoff of surfaces, right? And we have a lot of industries in the human world that produce waste products that are high in phosphorus and nitrogen. And so what happens in this case is, let's say, so one of the big ones actually is agriculture. So pig and cattle farms are actually pretty notorious for this. So the rainwater hits these industrial farms, so they've got tons of animals, right? And they're, raising them to eventually be killed. But they also, they're defecating, right? So there's like poop everywhere, and the rain essentially hits all the animal poop, and it pools up, and it runs off, and maybe it runs downstream, and let's say that runoff is going to eventually pool in a small pond that's nearby. It is a little gross, right? Like you don't want poop water in your pond, certainly, but it's also bad because what happens is it's picking up a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus from this waste and sort of pooling it all in this water source. And this causes a phenomenon that we call eutrophication. And so what this means is essentially that there is too much nutrition in the pool. And so the algae and cyanobacteria that live in this water source go nuts. They're having a great time because they've got so much, so many nutrients in order to, reproduce and survive and be very healthy, that they do what they call a bloom. And so if you have a pond or a lake on your property, or you have one nearby, this sometimes closes those areas for swimming, because you don't want to be in an area that has a lot of algae and cyanobacteria, because it could potentially be toxic to humans. Another problem with this is that you've got all these plant life, growing, and you might think like, oh, that's great. Like, I love plants. They're good for the environment and they make everything great. The issue is that you can have too much of a good thing here. And as these algae and cyanobacteria populations increase, I mean, they don't live forever, they eventually die. And so as they decompose, their decomposition process by the decomposing fungi and bacteria in the water actually consumes oxygen, and it consumes oxygen in the water source. And so what happens is we wind up with a situation called aquatic hypoxia. Hypoxia means lack of oxygen. So hypo meaning less, and then the oxia is like oxygen. So we wind up with insufficient oxygen in the water source. And unfortunately, this means that other organisms that need a lot of oxygen, like fish and snails and other guys that live in the water, they are now not able to survive. And so you wind up with this pool that is just dominated by algae and cyanobacteria, and nothing else can live there. You may have actually seen something like this. If you've ever seen a pond or lake that looks a little something like this, it's very green, or some species can be kind of more blue or yellow, or even red, depending on which pigment molecules they're using to photosynthesize. Mostly you're going to see green. But if you've ever seen something like this, this is a water source that has unfortunately fallen to eutrophication. So that's all I've got for you today. I think I meant that to be a little bit shorter than it actually wound up being, but if you have any questions about the material, let me know, and we can definitely talk about it. I think that, you'll again find that this material is pretty straightforward, but, do let me know if you have any questions, or just hop by conference to say hi. I always love to see you guys. And if you need anything in the meantime, let me know. Until next time, I will talk to you soon.